type of like high intensity activity. If you're doing that 4, 5, 6 times a week, and you're saying, "Hi, I wonder why I have this extra belly weight, or I can't see, I have this weight loss resistance." It might be because of what you just said, which is the guys feel great because they're more like the sun. They have more of a rhythm that follows, it's more of a circadian rhythm. Now, certainly we have circadian rhythms as well, but I always like to say men are like the sun and women are like the moon, right? Women have a bit of a longer, we have a bit of a longer cycle, which plays out over the course of, on an average, 29.5 days versus a guy who basically resets everything every 24 and a half hours or so. We are changing the way that we eat. We're changing the way that we exercise throughout the month to match up with, to live in harmony with the ever-changing hormonal landscape. So that's really kind of in a nutshell what cycle syncing.
Dr. Stephanie Estima, thank you so much for being on the Root Cause Medicine podcast.
I am honored. I was saying to you in the pre-chat that you asked me. I'm honored to be here. Thank you for having me.
Well, you have an amazing podcast yourself. And I say all the time to the people at Rupa Health that someday when I grow up, I want to be like Dr. Stephanie Estima's podcast. And I see all the wonderful guests you have on and the way that you educate the world in your book, which for those who are watching the video will see it directly behind me. And I am just thrilled, honored that you're here.
Thank you. I'm excited for our conversation today.
Well, today we're talking about cycle syncing and exercise. And I'm really excited to dive into that because I've been working more with athletes and how their cycle is largely affected by their exercise and vice versa. And you were honestly one of the first early people that I started following who was talking about this. You put it throughout your whole book. You talk about it on your social media website and what have you. So I'm going to pick your brain about that for the people. And you don't even have to be an athlete, which is what I love. You can be just a woman exerciser and realize that your cycle, your hormones totally affects whether you're able to run far, run fast, or jump high, or lift, or not, and what to do about that.
So, yeah, 100%.
Let me start off first, though. Why don't you introduce yourself a little bit? Give people a little background on who you are and what you stand for, and then we'll jump in.
Sure. Yeah. So my background, I always say I grew up in chiropractic. So that's my original training. That's the professional degree that I hold. And throughout my training, whether it was in chiropractic school or, post-grad education, always was fascinated and just had a love affair. It still exists today with brain metabolism and how the things that we do affect our brain. And it's always been very interesting to me that, it's the organ that we can't see, we can't touch it. We don't, but it's there all the time. It's the master control organ. And it's right now, controlling the muscles in my mouth and my tongue to form the words that are coming out of my mouth, et cetera. So I've always had just a love affair with functional neurology and neurology in general. Of course, in chiropractic, I have very heavy focus in the neuromusculoskeletal system. So how, the brain affects our posture, our movement patterns, compensatory or otherwise, and spent 16 years in a brick and mortar practice, practicing in Toronto, Canada. And in that practice, there was, of course, what people might think of the traditional chiropractic piece, which is the rehabilitation and movement pattern and getting rid of pain. But I very quickly realized that that's just the mechanical piece, right? So there's also a chemical component, let's say, even just with pain. If you have systemic inflammation because of the foods that you're eating or the medication that you're taking, that is going to affect your prognosis. It's going to affect your experience of pain. So I was just naturally doing nutritional consulting and, designing, well, for lack of a better word, diets. But when I say diet, it's like the food that you normally eat on a regular basis for my patients. And in that vein of loving everything brain, came across the ketogenic diet now, I don't know how many, maybe 2015, 2016, something like that. And was really amazed at not only the origins of the ketogenic diet, which was the diet that was used before we had, medication that would prevent seizures, was the intervention of choice in the 20s and 30s for helping children and adults to reduce their frequency, severity, and duration of seizures. So kind of went down that rabbit hole, introduced a ketogenic diet in practice, And then kind of coming around to my work today, very quickly noticed again, there was like a really distinct difference in the outcomes of a ketogenic diet in the male population. So my male patients and my female patients. So this was especially true. And this pattern kept coming up over and over again, where we'd have a husband and wife team. Let's say they were, patients of the practice, and they joined the ketogenic program that we were running. And the guy would come in and be like, "Doc, this is just the best. Like, I've dropped 15 pounds, like, testosterone's through the roof. I feel like I did when I was 20. And the woman is like, "I don't understand. I've been eating the same thing as my husband. I've dropped a pound, maybe that, and I feel like crap." So that really started me on this more really born out of curiosity around why this ketogenic, the same stimulus, the same application, we were seeing different outcomes in these two cohorts, if you will, or two patient populations. Right. And through my own experience, and then, kind of experimenting in the clinic, really did come to this body of work, which we're going to talk about today, which is how, and I talk about this idea that like women are not sort of smaller versions of men with just pesky hormones. We actually behave differently by way of our menstrual cycle and hormones that we'll talk about today. And we have to nuance, and we have to change the way that we eat, the way that we move, and the way that we think. And that is distinct from our male counterparts. So that's kind of the, back of the envelope history. My love of brain, love of diet. I myself have competed in like figure competition. So I've always had like just a huge reverence for the human body and the ability of the body to adapt. And, the application of tenets like the ketogenic diet and how we need to change that for women.
For women, I love that, because we get left out of a lot of research, or a lot of research, I should say, is extrapolated and applied to us, those of us who are cycling, as if it's same, right?
Correct.
Like, let's say exercise and how many times have women been told, hit CrossFit, going all in is like, that's great. You should do it all the time. It's what you should do. And then women are like, "But I feel worse," or "I got injured," or I feel like sometimes it feels really good, and other times it feels really bad. But yet my male counterpart feels good all the time. Like, what the heck? What is this about? And that's where the idea of this cycle syncing came. So can you just explain, like, what does that word even mean?
Yeah, so this is a word that's more commonly used now, and it basically means that we are changing the way that we eat, we're changing the way that we exercise throughout the month to match up with, to live in harmony with the ever-changing hormonal landscape, if you will, that a woman who is cycling, who's in her reproductive years, that includes our perimenopausal women, as her hormonal landscape changes, we are now altering the way that we're eating, the way that we're exercising and moving, the way that we're recovering. And we're noticing some of these ebbs and flows and changes in, let's say, that hormonal milieu, that and adapting to it. So that's really kind of in a nutshell what cycle syncing means. And I think that, to your point, I think it was, I want to say it's 2017, where the NIH mandated that women cannot be excluded. I mean, we're in 2022 now. Like, that is an incredible, like, 2017 was not that long ago. And we used to be excluded because the menstrual cycle was considered a confounding variable in research, because we were too, we were not controllable. And it's like, I always say, it's like, we're extra. We've always been extra, and we will always continue to be extra, but we should honor that. We should own that and say, okay, yes, I have this extra layer of complexity that I might as well, take the time to get to know, and how my unique bioindividuality, how my unique menstrual cycle, how I need to adapt so that I can support my cells, my body, in a way that she expects and requires. Because, you said something about like doing the CrossFit over and over again, or doing the Peloton, and, we'll get into heart rate and we'll get into exercising today, I'm sure. But I see so many women that are like, I do this, and I'm not throwing shade on Peloton, nothing,
right,
like,
totally.
I don't want a letter from, but any type of like high intensity activity, if you're doing that 4, 5, 6 times a week, and you're saying, "Hi, I wonder why I have this extra belly weight, or I can't see, I have this weight loss resistance." It might be because of what you just said, which is the guys feel great because they're more like the sun. They have more of a rhythm that follows, it's more of a circadian rhythm. Now, certainly we have circadian rhythms as well, but I always like to say men are like the sun and women are like the moon, right? Women have a bit of a longer, we have a bit of a longer cycle, which plays out over the course of, on an average, 29.5 days versus a guy who basically resets everything every 24 and a half hours or so. So yeah, we're very different. And that's my long-winded answer to your question. Like, what is cycle syncing? Well, let me tell you the history.
Let me go deep into it. No, but this is so important. Several years ago, I had a thyroid expert say to me, well, Carrie, even thyroid hormone follows the female cycle, meaning, so many women are on thyroid medication or struggling with their thyroid, and they go and get their thyroid tested. And let's say you even just get a TSH, which is thyroid stimulating hormone. If you test it close to and around ovulation, so in the middle of your cycle-ish area, ovulation, everything goes up. A lot of your hormones go up. It's like the Bellagio fountains, like everything goes up, right? To release the egg. So does TSH. Now, I'm not saying it goes up several points, but he was saying to me, in all my thyroid work, I have noticed there is a definite track, a rhythm. So if a woman is going to even test her thyroid, you should be wary of her cycle. So always test at ovulation, or test away from ovulation, but be consistent, because you may actually be changing her thyroid medication or supplementation or whatever you're doing because you don't realize that all these hormones are going up at the same time around ovulation. And even just that is not taken into account in research, right? In the literature. And I would say the majority of women don't know that when they go get like 99% don't, they're like, oh, I'm due for my thyroid check. I'm going to go get my blood checked for thyroid.
Right.
Even if
with no consideration of where they are. Yeah.
Nobody said, hey, make sure you get it away from ovulation. Maybe the best time is on your period. Be very consistent every time, because I love that you said we're extra. I will take it. I am 100% extra, and you know that. But it's in a good way. And so when did you first notice on yourself? I mean, you are Miss Cover of a magazine and big in fitness. And when did you notice that your cycle really played a role in your ability to exercise, or how you exercised?
Yeah, well, I'm going to be totally honest and transparent for you and your listeners. It wasn't until my 30s. Like I always had this like, God, I hate my period. Like, and I write about this in my book, The Betty Body, that it always just felt like a punishment for being a woman. It's like, here it is again. And I had to medicate, and I would just ignore it because I didn't really put it together. I was like, if I just take some Anaprox, or I just take some Midol or whatever, I can just punch through whatever I need to punch through, rather than honoring, my body's need for rest and recovery. And we can talk a little bit about that, but I'll say that it wasn't really until even like really mid to late 30s where I started, and this was after I had children, like thankfully I looked at my husband and I was pregnant. So I had no trouble with fertility, but then it was
in that, cute.
Yeah. But then in that post child, that postpartum, where things can be a little up and down and all over the place for several years, because you are nutritionally, physically, spiritually, everything depleted in those years, really started paying attention to how my cycle was changing. And I went through, let's see, how old was I? Gosh, I want to say I was 37 or 8, went through I was going through a divorce. My clinic had actually, so when it rains, it pours over here. So, went through a divorce, and my clinic burned down at the time. So there was like an electrical fire in the clinic, and like the whole thing was like reduced. The only thing that was left was my degree. I have no idea how my degree didn't get singed, but that's the only thing that was left. And then we had these little activities for kids who were coming into the practice. Like they would make these little pictures. There was one picture that was left from like so anyway, went away with nothing. And took my children on a trip, like, later that summer, we were finalizing the divorce. Like, again, you can imagine my cycle was a gong show, still not putting it together. Went to Italy for 3 weeks or so, got a lot of movement, got a lot of sunshine, was sleeping finally for the first time, like through the night, and got my period while I was in, towards the end of that trip. And because I had the sun exposure, because I was, managing my stress a little better on that vacation, because I was eating foods that weren't, toxic, nutrient devoid garbage, noticed almost instantly like that. Usually when I get before that point, before I had my period, that bleed week, I would be medicating with really heavy medication several times a day. I would always bring, I think I've told this to you, maybe personally or offline, but I would always, to practice, if it was the first or second day of my period, I would take 2 pairs of pants with me, because 100% of the time I would bleed through the pair of pants that I went to work with. And I would get up out of a consultation, like let's say I was seeing a patient, let's say, and we were, talking about, their x-rays or ultrasound or whatever. I would get out of the chair in such a way that I would turn the chair around so the patient would never see, that potentially that there had been an accident. Right.
Right.
So anyway, in Italy, had a glorious period. Like, we're at the beach and I was still I didn't have to medicate. I didn't have to hole up in the hotel room all night long or all day long. I was still able to go, to the beach and like not worry about it. And I was like, what happened? What was this big change here? Like, yes, I get it. Food, everything is like a little bit more dolce vita, in Italy. What were some of the things that, even though the environment changed, it's still my body that did all the work. So can I reproduce this back home? And then kind of started on this journey to understanding the difference. And then at that point, I was already running that nutrition program that I had mentioned before. So just to kind of, with the timeline, to kind of, complete the timeline, if you will, for your listeners, then started saying, okay, to my females, I was like, okay, so you've only lost like a pound or 2 in the last month. Why don't we start changing the way that you eat with your cycle and see if that makes a difference, right? Instead of trying to white knuckle your way all the way through the month, eating the same way, let's start playing with a couple of things. And then that's when I started noticing for my patients and myself that I was actually able to maintain what I had experienced in Italy back in, Toronto, where we have all 4 seasons and we don't have the gelato that they have or the espresso.
Or the beach.
or the beach. Yeah.
Not like Italy anyway. So at a high level, taking all that knowledge, if somebody's listening to this right now, and don't worry, we are literally going to break down each step of your cycle and talk about what's changing and what you can do. At a high level, if somebody's listening to this going, that's me, I am bleeding through everything, I have terrible PMS, I take a lot of medication, my periods suck, all the things, what do you see improve with your women that you work with as they start to honor their cycle, understand their cycle, and change with their cycle, as opposed to everything is the same all the time?
The first thing that we often see is the bleed week improving. So we will see the quality of the flow improving. So whereas before you might have, let's say you were estrogen dominant, and we'll define that in a moment, but let's say there's too much estrogen in the second half of your cycle. Often what we see I always say like your bleed week is kind of like a report card. It's like telling you how you did over the course of the month. So we would see improvement in clotting. So normally I will say that some clotting is okay, as long as it's smaller than, let's say, the size of a quarter, it's around the size of a dime, that's fine. But as long as it's not only clots, right? So some clotting, but we're kind of measuring the size, the flow of blood as well. So before, like I was saying, I had this like technique of like turning my chair so that no one would see that I'd stained the chair. So that heaviness of flow, certainly it's going to be heavier the first and maybe second day of your bleed week, but then it shouldn't be so much like the delta or the amplitude shouldn't be so high that you're like bleeding through pants and things like that. And then of course the duration we will also see improving as well. So ideally you're bleeding somewhere between like 4 and 6 days. That's sort of like, what I would say is optimal. And then the color of the blood as well. So looking at the color of the blood, it should be kind of like a dark, or even like a bright red at the beginning. And then as we go through the bleed week, we will see it, tends to be brown, a little bit more brown. That's just like the oxidized sort of older blood that's kind of still hanging around and has yet to be passed. So you'll see it. Usually the first thing that you'll see is an improvement in flow, and also even symptoms as well. So leading up to your bleed week, a lot of women will say like the couple of days before, the 2 to 3 days before you actually start bleeding is when most women will feel the most sensitive. They might experience the most cramping. They might feel the most uncomfortable, brain foggy. And just as an aside, I'll say that wherever you are right now, however old you are, that little 3-day window is almost like a glimpse into what menopause might be for you, right? So depending on where you are, because what you're seeing essentially there is an acute drop in your estrogen and your progesterone hormones, which then leads to this ischemic presentation. And then we have the uterine lining. We shed the uterine line, which is what the blood is in your pad or your cup or whatever. So if you're very sensitive that week, if you feel like you can't focus, if you feel moody, if you're in pain, this is a window for you into the future. In a way, it can be predictive of how you might experience menopause if you're not making the appropriate changes, let's say, that you should. Yes. So that would be like some of the first things that we see improving. It's like the leading up to the bleed week is better. So that symptomatic presentation is better. They're still able to, engage in their activities of daily living without needing to heavily medicate or take time off or take a sick day or whatever. And then the actual bleed week as well is not preventing them from doing the activities that they normally would otherwise.
So let's stay with bleed week. You've got your period. You're listening right now. You have your period. What is happening? Where are your hormones at? And where are you on the exercise spectrum, on the food spectrum when you're talking with your women?
Sure. Yeah. So in terms of hormones, I think that's maybe a better, like, let's just kind of lay the groundwork for what's happening in that first week. So the week before, as I mentioned, that little mini menopause, right? So we have this big acute drop in estrogen, all of a sudden, big acute sudden drop in progesterone. And that sort of, it continues that way through that first half, at least, of your bleed week. So the first 3 to 4 days, let's say, your estrogen levels stay relatively low. Actually, everything is pretty low except for follicular stimulating hormone, which, this, I'm talking to the choir, but for my listeners, FSH does kind of what it sounds like. It's stimulating the follicle, right? Because the whole point of your cycle is to ovulate. It's not to bleed, even though she's the popular girl. Period gets all the attention, but the whole point of your cycle is to ovulate. So what happens in those first 2 weeks is you'll see follicular, and particularly in the first week, follicular stimulating hormone, we see at a high level because she's trying to get those follicles to develop and mature. And then there's going to be there will be only the chosen one, that one follicle, right? With that egg, with that precious egg, the soil, as men are the seed and women are the soil. So we have that egg that is going to be released eventually from that follicle. So in terms of food and in terms of exercise, I am a big proponent, and this is like one of the hills I'm going to die on for women, which is lift heavy weights all through your cycle. Heavy weights all through your cycle. However, the way that you lift changes. So we'll kind of go through this. I think where you're going is like week by week. Mm-hmm. And what I like in week one, so what would be normal for you in week one, that week of your period, that bleed week, is maybe the first or second day, maybe you are a little crampy, and that's normal because the uterus is contracting. So if you've had children, you understand what that uterine contraction might feel like. To a lesser degree, you might feel that day one, maybe day two of your cycle. So maybe there's some lethargy, low energy. If you want to take a day off or two there, like, have at it, no problem. Once you kind of get into the flow, once you get into the flow of things, I'm a nerd. I just think that these things endlessly amuse me. Okay. So when you get into kind of the rhythm, let's say, of your bleed week, I really love moderate rep sets here. So I talk about this in the Betty Body and I go into detail, and there's like workout programs and stuff in there, but somewhere between like 8 to 12, let's say, repetitions. That still means that you're lifting heavy though. No, I'm not throwing shade on any fitness influencer, but these are not 2-pound pink dumbbells. These are heavy weights for 8 reps or heavy weights for 12 reps. By the end of the 12th rep, you shouldn't be able to do 13. So that doesn't mean, oh, it's like it's the easy week. I get to just do something that I can punch out 8 times and be mindless about. You want to be very concerned with your form, and it's heavy weights for 8 to 12 reps. In terms of food, I typically like, because we don't have progesterone. So progesterone kind of takes a vacation for the first 2 weeks. And we know that progesterone is a potent stimulator of our appetite, slows down the bowel, slows down our GI tract and our digestive system and our bowel movements really. It's actually a really great week for if you want to experiment with a longer fast or experiment with carbohydrate restriction. This is a great week for it. And most people are like, what? I'm like a ravenous beast on my period. But once you start paying attention to kind of some of the ebbs and flows, and we remove some of the inflammation that you might be experiencing, you'll notice that your appetite, it should lower in that first week. So I do like there to be, if you want, you can play with a longer fast. Longer to me means more than like a daily fast. So I have, usually through the month, I will practice some type of time restricted eating schedule, somewhere between 12 to kind of 14 or 16 hours, depending on my mood and how I'm sleeping and how I'm exercising and when I'm training, et cetera. But this week you can play with, if you wanted to do a longer one, if you're like, hey, let me try like a 24-hour, like, let me do like a dinner to dinner kind of thing. See if I can do that. This would be a great week to try it because you're not going to be as hungry. And a ketogenic diet, like carbohydrate restriction, is another thing you might play with this week. So restricting more carbohydrates here would be wonderful. I am an advocate for eating meat. I think especially this week is important because you are losing a lot of minerals and vitamins, and you're losing a lot of blood. Like the reason why we tell men to give blood every 3 months or 6 months or so is to mimic the menstrual cycle, because we lose blood every month. So you need to be consuming foods, in my opinion, in my very humble opinion, and this is not based on any ethical or environmental slant, is meats are a really animal proteins are a really great way to replenish the lost ferritin. And it can be if you're sort of eating, let's say, some liver and you're having some organ meats and you're also having some, what we might call traditional meats, which is like the skeletal muscle, you're going to get a full complement of your essential amino acids. You're going to be getting your B vitamins. You're going to be getting all the things that I typically see vegetarians and vegans be deficient in. And I say that with love. It's not, if you're a vegetarian or you're a vegan and doesn't fit you, you can certainly get your protein requirements with plants. Like you can get there with plants. You do have to do we'll say your jurisprudence, let's say, in learning how to combine foods to make sure that you're getting that full complement of amino acids and that you're not running deficient in your B vitamins, which is like kind of the two things that I see the most common kind of happening in that population. So exercise is heavy, but it's 8 to 12. Ketogenic diet is great this week. And I would also say you can play with fasting as well.
It's amazing when my period starts. First of all, I'm ravenous the couple days before. I know it's coming. I don't sleep as well. I'm ridiculously ravenous. I want all of the chocolate in all of the world, dark chocolate, all the dark chocolate in all of the world. I tease my friends, go buy chocolate, because when I go to the store, I'm buying all of it. And then as soon as my period comes, it's like, and I can't do long fast. I intermittent fast quite often. But the couple days before my period, I can't do long intermittent fasting, which is fine. When I wake up hungry, I eat. I just listen to my body.
As you should.
And I've been doing this long enough to know. I know sometimes people are jumping into this new and the signals are confusing, and I understand that, but I'm just further ahead in the chapters, right? You and I are further ahead in the chapters of the same book. Some people are in chapter 1, you and I are way up there in 25. So, and then my period starts and immediately hunger goes away. I don't crave chocolate all the time. I can do 16-hour fasts without an issue. And I just love it. I just love the biochemistry and physiology so much that literally in a one night, flip, my body's like, cool, not pregnant, got her period. all the switches in my electrical box change. I'm
I
a
love
whole new
that.
person.
And I, like you, have so much reverence for anatomy and physiology and how it's so true. Like, and I talk about this in week 4 and we'll get there. We'll expand on it, but you should be eating more that week. And you should, if you're wanting the dark chocolate. I mean, I think you should have dark chocolate all the time, but
completely. Yeah.
but if you want more of it that week, you should have more of it that week. And there should be zero shame and zero guilt around it, because I think that we all have grown up in this sort of, and this is like, I have boys at home. I love men, this is not an anti-men thing, but we live in this world that is designed by men for men. Even, we can even extend that into the corporate world, right? It's like, what's rewarded in the corporate world? Getting up early, doing your 5 a.m., 5 a.m. club, blah, blah, blah. And then going to work early, getting all the meetings. And then what happens after work? You go and you do your 5 to 7 drinks with you're socializing with your, buddies or whatever. And then you go home and then you go to sleep and then you repeat it all again. Well, that's again, a circadian rhythm. Like women, we'll get into this, but we need actually more sleep than men do.
Yeah.
So getting up and doing the 5 a.m. club, that may or may not work for your lifestyle, but you shouldn't try to force that if that's what you think you should be doing. And, men, they have a lot of testosterone in the morning, right? Which is like, they should wake up.
They're supposed to.
With
Ready
an erection.
To go.
Yeah. Way to go. Good for you guys. Right. And then as the day goes on, of course, their testosterone lowers. And then we see that they're more estrogen, like they're more estrogen dominant, let's say in the second half of the day. And that's corporate culture, right? It's like, we put them in their man cave. They do they do all their work early in the morning. They get there before before no one's in the office. And then in the afternoon, they're taking meetings. They do the 5 à 7 or the 5 to 7, drinks with people because they're more chatty at 5 p.m. than they are at 10 a.m. At 10 a.m., they're like cavemen. At 5 p.m., they're ready to talk and they're ready to have a beer and socialize. So I know that's a tangent, but all that to say that the world is designed for a lot of the hormonal cadence that men have. And there's going to be times in your cycle, we're about to get there in week 2, where you very much have more testosterone, where you very much are more extroverted and flirty, and your receptivity to sex, let's say, is amplified, but it's not every day. So,
let's go into that. So now we are out of our period and we're into week 2. So we're into our pre-ovulatory week, as we call it. What's happening with our hormones here? And again, exercise, diet, emotions, like what's happening?
Yeah, great. I love this is a fun week because one of the things we were just alluding to it is testosterone, which is it's sort of flat all through the month, but this is the week where we do see an amplification of testosterone. And Mother Nature, she's a wily minx. Like, she knows that in a couple days there may be an egg to be fertilized. So what does she do? She ramps up your testosterone, which of course is famous for its effect on libido. So what that's going to do, it's going to make you hornier. You're going to be more receptive to having sex with your partner or partners. The sensitivity of your clitoris is going to also be amplified. So you will orgasm easier and they will be much more powerful. And so you have to, you should know that, because if you want children or if you don't want children, you may choose this week to either, have at it with, like, let's say penetrative sex, or knowing that you don't want children, maybe there's other avenues, that you might explore with your, with your partners or your loved ones. So testosterone is coming up. So is estrogen. So estrogen, has this meteoric rise. It's actually quite astounding. Like, it will go from, I don't know, 20, 40, 60 picograms per milliliter. And I've seen it as high as 600 picograms per milliliter. Like, I've seen it really high. Normally we'll see it up to like 200, maybe 300. But these are 2 anabolic hormones, meaning growth, right? These are 2 hormones that build, right? So estrogen is now trying to finish what follicular stimulating hormone started, right? So we see estrogen elevated for maybe 50 or so hours. in that meteoric rise that we were talking about, followed by luteinizing hormone, which is another hormone we haven't touched on really, but luteinizing hormone, again, sort of flat everywhere else in the cycle. And then this week following that 50-hour rise, we see, I call it like luteinizing hormone. I call it like my Uncle Ralph. So like, it's like my uncle, I have an Uncle Ralph. He's lovely. He always comes in to like every family dinner after we've all eaten, right? And he'll come to me like, Steph, how are you? Whack, right on the back of my, right on the back of my thing, which one year, first time he did it, I kind of spit my food out, which is exactly what luteinizing hormone does. It goes all the way up very acutely, about 10 or so hours after estrogen, and then comes back down. And the whole point is to help the follicle release the egg. So that's what's happening from a hormonal perspective. From a physical appearance perspective, let's say, estrogen is going to plump up your lips. It's going to, make your skin glowy. Your eyes are white. You're bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. It's like natural Botox, natural fillers, all the things. Testosterone, as we mentioned, it's going to have a profound effect on your sex drive. And from a sort of social perspective, you're going to be much more, I always say, like, I can people this week. Like I can people like a boss this week because I'm out. I'm like, I want to chat to people. I want to sit down and learn about their story. Like I want to learn, I want to know everything about people this week. And you will find that you're going to be more extroverted. This is a great time, for you to be, let's say, networking or even doing presentations. They've done studies where they've taken a picture of a woman's face all through her cycle, and statistically significant results with men rating the woman's face only, just her visage, as more attractive in this second week versus the others. And that's under the influence, again, of estrogen and testosterone, as we've been mentioning. So from a nutritional perspective, this through line of like lift heavy weights all through the cycle. This is a week where we see it's a very special week because testosterone, this is the only time where we see it rise. So I actually like to change the way that we eat to complement that, to support that. So I like to increase the protein content that we are like the amount of protein, let's say, that we're consuming. So whereas let's say in week 1, you might have been doing a ketogenic style diet, typically a 70-20-10 breakdown, like 70% fat, 20% protein, which is like a moderate protein restriction as well. And then, low on the carbohydrates. This week, I actually like that to be totally flipped on its head. So I like to double the protein and double the carbohydrates. So doubling the protein would bring you up to 40% protein. Doubling the carbs from last week would bring you up to 20%. And the reason for that, of course, is when you're consuming protein, and I'm putting the caveat here of like a complete protein, you are going to drive something called muscle protein synthesis, which is just like what it sounds. You're producing muscle. So the more protein that you consume, you will help to drive muscle growth. And we'll tie this in with training in just a moment. But I want to explain the carbohydrate piece as well. So carbohydrates have unfortunately been demonized by many people in the ketogenic community. And I think that if you're having a lot of processed carbohydrates, this does become an issue. But when you are training regularly, you need carbohydrates, number one, to help repair, but most importantly, it helps prevent muscle protein breakdown. So protein synthesis. So we're amping up protein synthesis through increasing our protein intake. And then we're also preventing muscle protein breakdown. Ladies in perimenopause, listen up, because you have to preserve your muscles at all costs. And this is a unique time in your life where you're kind of coming up to a point where you're going to be in a low estrogen and a low testosterone environment. So take advantage of this week. Make sure that you are building protein in the kitchen, and we'll talk about in the gym. Actually, we'll do that now. So I was saying in week 1, moderate sets, right? Still heavy. Here, I like the weight to increase. So you're lifting heavier, but now you're only doing it for like 5 reps, maximum 8, like 5 to 7, 5 to 8 reps. So it's still heavy, but it's heavy for that set. It's heavy for the amount of times you're going to lift or squat or press or whatever you're doing. So you can actually have the exact same workout all month long. And I recommend that because that's how we see results, is by doing, like, fitness is not that confusing. It's like, we need to have compound movements followed by some smaller isolated, you do, let's say you do pull, like you do a squat before you work your calves, let's say. So you want to have things like squats and lunges and hip thrusters. You want to have overhead presses and pulls and push-ups. These are compound movements, but you're just changing how it happens over the month. So in week 1, you were doing like 8 to 12. Now you're doing 5 to 7,
but higher weight.
It's a higher weight. Correct. Those are some of the considerations I would say. The other thing I'll say, and I didn't mention cardio in week 1, so I'll just come back to that in a sec. I don't like heavy fat, like long fasts here as well. So this is the week before you ovulate. Your ovaries are literally always scanning the environment for threat. If you're doing like 24, 36, 72 hour, whatever fasts, right before you ovulate, you can potentially affect ovulation. And the reason why I say that is the ovaries themselves, when we kind of look at the density of mitochondria in them, and you know this, 100,000 mitochondria per oocyte, something ridiculous like that.
It's huge. Yeah.
Versus, even if you just look at the liver, kind of an important organ, we'd be dead in like 4 minutes, if we didn't have our liver working. 2,000 mitochondria per hepatocyte. Okay. 100,000 per oocyte in the ovaries, 2,000 mitochondria approximately per hepatocyte. Myocyte, so heart, 5,000. So your ovaries are literally the eyes, like the eyes in your body that can't see, but they're always looking for threat. So if you are in a long fast, this is going to be like, it's probably not a good time to ovulate. There doesn't seem to be a lot of food for the baby. So I'm going to just we'll skip this month. We'll see how we do next month. I'll just not.
It's a nope.
Can we not? Yeah. They're going to be like, can we not? No, there's no food. So I don't like long fasts here. So I typically, and it sounds like you do the same, I intermittent fast daily. I typically try to, limit my food sort of towards the end of the day before I go to sleep. I usually eat almost immediately after I train in the morning, because that's just what works for me. But I typically will do like a 12, or maybe a 10-14, something like that this week. What was the other thing I wanted to make sure I mentioned?
Cardio.
Oh, cardio. Yes. Thank you. So cardio, this is where it gets a little, so I'm a really big fan of all cardio, not throwing shade. You should always do cardio. It helps with your cardiopulmonary system, longevity, everything. The type of cardio that you do through your cycle also matters. So this week in particular, we mentioned that we have that surge of estrogen. And this became very apparent to me, even when I was still in practice. I would change the way I was adjusting patients based on where they were in their menstrual cycle, because estrogen makes your ligaments lax and it makes your tendons stiff. So lax is just like a fancy word for loosey-goosey, if you're not familiar with that term. So you are more prone to injury with more burst type motion this week. So if you're doing like sprints, burpees, anything where it's kind of like more high intensity interval training, the moves that you typically see in a HIIT session.
Yeah. Box jumps,
exactly. More likely to damage the ligaments. And we actually see this in the literature with athletes, where we see more catastrophic injury to the ACL ligament. That's kind of what's been studied in female athletes in and around that pre-ovulatory week leading up, coming up to ovulation. So you can still do cardio for all my cardio bunnies listening. I just like it to be more steady state. So low intensity, steady state. I talk about it in terms of zones. So like zone 1 and 2, even 3 is appropriate. And I like that. I like those zones as my base for cardio, because that's kind of where life happens, right? We go for walks in zone 1, we move and we garden in zone 1, maybe 2, when you're moving homes, let's say, or you're cleaning the kitchen, it's like zone 1, maybe it'll touch a zone 2. So I think if you train the zone where most of your life happens, I think that that's also really important. So you can do any type of training, any type of cardio in week 1, whatever suits your fancy. Just in week 2, I love my ladies to abstain from HIIT because of that estrogen piece where we see the ligaments are a little bit more lax, but it also lends to heavy lifting, right? Because the tendons are now stiff. And of course, the tendons are what cross the bone. It's what attaches the muscle to the bone. And you can withstand a heavier weight, right? Because of that stiffness that the tendon has this week. So those are the considerations for cardio there as well.
As some of my colleagues, like we nerd out on this with our cycle when where I live in Portland, Oregon, skiing is really big. And
Right.
a girlfriend of mine, I happened to run into a girlfriend of mine. This was 2 years ago at a restaurant, and she'd blown out her knee skiing. And she goes, "Oh, I should have known better. I was preovulatory." And I knew what that meant,
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
she had gone to make a quick turn while skiing and blew out her knee in the process. It was that quick burst, a lot of pressure on the knee force, and down she went.
There's nothing worse than having an injury, especially if you're someone who loves training. Like if she loves skiing and she knew it could have been avoided, there's nothing worse than injuring yourself when you knew it was avoidable.
And it doesn't mean she didn't have to ski. She could have skied, but just know her, like, maybe don't hit those black diamonds,
Right.
like maybe
Right.
don't try to keep up with her teenage sons that week, because she's more at risk for knee injury, and it happened to her. And the famous story is it the 2016 US Olympic soccer team trained to their menstrual cycle, because of course soccer players have a lot of burst movement, and their trainer was really trying to work with them on where they were in their cycle. And this is something we will address later. It doesn't mean when nothing that Stephanie is saying is not ever or never. And we will talk about training too, as opposed to just stopping completely. But I want to move on into week 3. So now we have ovulated, the egg is released, and she's floating through the, fallopian spheres. What is happening now as we move into week 3 with your hormones, estrogen, progesterone, and what do you feel now with exercise and nutrition?
Great. So just as a side note, this was like a shock to my upbringing as a Catholic, but you can't actually get pregnant all month long. I don't know.
Cannot. But they'll tell you that in school.
We've said that, we've talked about this, but I used to think that going into a pool, I was going to get pregnant. And this is like, I don't know, like, hopefully it's changed. Obviously I haven't been in the Catholic school system for a long time, but I was like, oh my God, I can get pregnant all the time. That egg, depending on your age, is kind of viable somewhere between like 4 and let's say 24 hours. Like about a day. Hours, not days. Yes. Because you can, the sperm can kind of live there for a couple of days beforehand, but that egg, she's there for like a day.
Mm-hmm. She's making an appearance. She's literally a celebutante who has been paid to make an appearance. Yes. And then she leaves.
Yeah, exactly right. Exactly right. So so let's assume that you've ovulated. So that egg is sort of floating in that, what did you call it? The fallopian sphere.
The fallopian sphere.
The fallopian sphere. And so now